Okay, I think we can begin. So welcome everybody to this morning's webinar. I'm Alan Barrett, the director of the ESRI, and this morning we're going to be discussing the latest report from my colleagues Bertrand Maitre, Helen Russell and Emer Smith on the dynamics of child poverty in Ireland. I think I've commented on a good number of occasions. I think of all the work the Institute does, issues of child poverty are just enormously important and enormously challenging. And I think I once wrote in a tweet or whatever that if the Institute did one good thing, increasing our understanding of the causes of child poverty and plotting some sort of a route through this very difficult problem, I think that would be just an enormously worthwhile thing for a research institute to achieve. So just two quick points. I mean, I think we collectively understand the importance of the issue, but luckily now in Ireland, through the Growing Up in Ireland survey, of course, which is now being collected by my colleagues in the Institute with collaboration from people in Trinity, and of course generally funded by the Department of Children now for many years. We are developing this database that's giving us a much stronger insight into the factors in particular that lead kids to fall into situations of poverty, and then perhaps more importantly giving us a sense of what leads to families then being stuck in poverty, because again, I'm often sort of reminded of some of the discussion sometimes about the minimum wage, where people sometimes sort of shrug if you talk about the number of people in a minimum wage. They sort of say, well, maybe that's a temporary difficulty. And likewise, when we were looking at poverty in a cross-sectional sort of way, sometimes people could get, not I'm saying casual, but sometimes the argument would be, well, look, if these people go on and get jobs and everything like that, you know, maybe the problem will work itself out. But with the longitudinal data that's now been collected through GUI, we have a much stronger sense as to what allows families, what are the factors that facilitate movement out of poverty, and what leads to people sort of being stuck in poverty. And I think these are tremendously important insights when we're developing policy in this area. So I'm delighted that the Institute is undertaking this work. Really grateful to the Department of Children and others to be working with us on this. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to the Minister, who's kindly come along this morning to say a few words to us. Then my colleague Helen Russell will take you through the details of the report. Delighted to say Tanya Ward, who will be very well known to everybody and an old friend of the ESRI, has joined us, and Tanya will give us another perspective. And then hopefully towards the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. And if you can be thinking about your questions and submitting them through the Q&A function, hopefully we'll have a good lively interaction towards the latter part of this event, and we'll try and wrap up by 11:30. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Minister O'Gorman, and again, delighted that you're able to join us this morning, Minister.
Thanks very much, Alan. And look, I'm absolutely delighted to be launching another piece of research with our colleagues in the ESRI. As you know, this report here is the latest output of the research partnership between the ESRI and my department, and it's the second report in the child-specific poverty research programme. As you know, I launched the first one by Delma Byrne and Morag Trainer, Income, Poverty and Deprivations Among Children, and that was published last July. So really, I'm very grateful to be invited to launch this report today. I want to thank Bertrand Maitre and the two co-authors, Emer Smith and Helen Russell, for inviting me to launch another piece of really important research, the dynamics of child poverty in Ireland. The report that I launched last July, it was useful in providing a baseline as regards understanding the situation of children living in poverty in Ireland. And I think it provided a real insight into the depth of poverty experienced by children and their move in and out of poverty. The report that we're publishing today really furthers our understanding of child poverty in Ireland, and it does that by drawing very significantly on the huge range of data that's available from the Growing Up in Ireland survey, that longitudinal survey of children in Ireland. And the richness of the data is generated by the fact that there are now 7 distinct waves of data that has been derived from the two cohorts that are being studied. And this allows us to undertake a really comprehensive understanding of how many families are at risk of poverty, how that risk changes over time, both as the age of the child changes, but also as the economy changes as well. And look, a report like this, it's only really of value if we learn from the findings and if we utilize that information in the policies we implement. And I've certainly very extensively used the data from the Growing Up in Ireland surveys as I push for action within my own department, but particularly across government in terms of addressing child poverty. I think we know poverty is complex, and many families have periods of poverty, and then they also may experience periods of relative economic stability. And we know life happens, people gain work, people lose work, families break up, they reform, they get sick, they get injured, hopefully they recover. And I think it's important for us to understand that very dynamic nature of poverty. My department oversees the Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures policy approach, and that includes a commitment to lift 70,000 children out of consistent poverty by 2020. And to date, significant work has been done as regards the achievement of that target, involving work across government, but also in collaboration with the NGO sector as well. And there has been some progress. There was a 4.6% drop in the child poverty rate between 2014 and 2019, but still 8.1% of children in this country live in consistent poverty. And this clearly is not good enough. Too many children experience poverty, be it temporarily or of a more permanent basis. And before I hand over to the authors today, I just wanted to reflect on two particular findings from this particular piece of work. And the first just ties into that cumulative effect of poverty. Any time spent in poverty is detrimental and results in poor outcomes for a child in terms of their general well-being, in education, in socioeconomic development, in relationship with their peers, but also in terms of poor physical health as well. And the more time spent in poverty means that the child's overall outcomes are going to be worse. And the authors have found that nearly half of the children in the study have experienced economic vulnerability at some point in their lives, even if that's only been temporarily. And I think that really does bear repeating. Nearly half of all children are poor at some point in their childhood. And we know that being poor in childhood is detrimental. And I think this really underlines the need for us to take urgent action to address the issue of child poverty. I was also very struck by the finding that a change in employment status can trigger a move into or out of poverty. And losing a job, this signals a period of economic vulnerability, but also moving into full-time employment can mark a transition out of poverty as well. And this is why I'm absolutely committed to providing affordable, accessible and good quality childcare, because it's only if a parent feels that their children are happy and well looked after that they will want to be available for full-time work. And I think this research is very important. It helps refocus our minds on the importance of this particular issue, and it will help inform our approach to the very important next steps. First of all, a new national policy framework for children and young people, and our approach to tackling child poverty, and the linkages to the EU Child Guarantee, which is going to be a huge opportunity for Ireland. So the EU Child Guarantee offers countries guidance on integrated strategies to tackle child poverty and also to promote children's well-being. And it goes beyond welfare, it goes beyond labour market participation, but looks at promoting access to quality services and active participation for children themselves. And I think the EU Child Guarantee is going to give Ireland an opportunity to refocus and re-evaluate our own approach to tackling child poverty and to promoting children's welfare. And the guarantee calls on member states to guarantee children free access to early childhood education and care, education, including school-based activities, and healthcare, and ensure effective access to good food, a healthy meal each school day, and to adequate housing. And the EU Child Guarantee has just been agreed now under the Portuguese presidency by the Commission and all the member states. And I'm proud to say that the Irish delegation played a very prominent role in those negotiations. My department has established a new EU and international unit, and that's going to play a key role in the implementation and the coordination of the Child Guarantee on an Irish basis. And the effective implementation of the EU Child Guarantee will involve the active input of all key government departments. The experience of my own department with Better Outcomes, Brighter Futures will inform the design and the implementation of the Child Guarantee to ensure that it's effective. And I'm pleased to announce that this summer my department appointed an attaché on EU and international affairs. This is the first time we've done that in the department, and the new attaché will work closely with the new international unit, particularly on the EU Child Guarantee. As the report we're launching today makes clear, poverty is more complicated than simply a lack of money. Poverty can be a transient period of time, and there are various triggers into and out of a period of economic vulnerability. And additionally, there are family characteristics which make them inherently more susceptible to poverty. And I was particularly struck by how disability affects the likelihood of poverty. And this speaks to the wider remit of my department and how child poverty crosses disability, integration, equality, and many other policy concerns of this department. And as a government, we need to support families who are at risk of either transient or consistent poverty. And to do that effectively, we must understand more about the impacts of poverty, the triggers that bring families into economic vulnerability, and exactly who are most at risk. And the full impact of the pandemic has yet to be understood, but it is clear that we need to mitigate its effects on children and young people in particular. And it's for this reason that the government acted swiftly to cushion the financial impact of unemployment in particular by providing CUP the pandemic unemployment payment. Child poverty and our efforts to eradicate disadvantage for the most vulnerable will remain a top priority in the next national policy framework for children and young people. So once again, I want to give my thanks to Bertrand, to Emer, and to Helen for this really important, this really insightful piece of work. As I say, I'll be drawing heavily from it in terms of my own, the work we do within the department and my engagement with other departments as well. We are very clear in terms of the EU Child Guarantee. We see that as an important tool in terms of both a coordination, but also the resources to tackle child poverty over the next number of years. But we also understand that that work needs to take place across all government departments. So thanks again to the ESRI for their partnership with us on this really important work, and thanks to everyone for joining this seminar today.
Great, thanks so much, Minister. I think the Minister seems to be. I don't know, anyway, the Minister seems to be still talking, but is muted. I'm not sure. Just to say, anyway, it's always a pleasure to have you along, but I'm always struck by the scale of the task ahead. So we'll hopefully continue to support you anyway in that as the years go by. Okay, Helen, I think, are you ready then to share your screen and go through the presentation?
Yes, thank you. I'll just get this going. So can you see that?
Yeah, can indeed, all good.
Great. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for coming along today. I'm going to present on behalf of my co-authors, Bertrand and Emer. So let's get this moving. Okay. So just by way of background before I go into the results. So we know from a great deal of previous research that children and young people in Ireland are more likely than adults to be at risk of income poverty and material deprivation. We also know from the international literature that poverty impacts on children and young people in a very wide variety of ways, from health and education to well-being. And also the literature suggests that the effects of poverty, of child poverty, might be influenced by both its timing. So for example, in periods of development, for critical periods, but also in its persistence. So how long people are, and young people particularly, are exposed to poverty is likely to impact the outcomes. We also have seen more generally from panel studies and longitudinal studies across the entire population around how poverty is not a static state, and that people are moving in and out of poverty, and that, as Alan said, that persistent poverty or long-term poverty is the most damaging. And it also, this sort of longitudinal approach allows us to look at the factors that influence moves in and out of poverty. So the questions that we look at in the study are, first of all, what are the longitudinal patterns of poverty for each GUI cohort, and I'll explain that in a second. Which families are most at risk of persistent poverty? Then what are the triggers that influence transitions into and out of poverty, looking at labour market and family events. And then we look briefly at how persistent or transient poverty is associated with child outcomes, and then we look at some of the implications of the findings. So we draw on the Growing Up in Ireland study, and we make use of all the available data that's available so far. So that means that we have 4 waves for the younger cohort. So this is the 08 cohort that I'll refer to throughout. And this group we followed from 9 months to 9 years of age, and there's 4 waves of data available. And then the 98 cohort, this is the older cohort, are followed from 9 years to 17, 18 years. So how do we measure poverty in this study? So along with a long tradition of ESRI research, we take a multidimensional approach to poverty measurement, and we use a technique called latent class analysis, and we build on work by our colleagues, our former colleagues, Dorothy Watson and Chris Whelan and others in previous research that have used this method. And the measure is based on 3 elements. So the first is economic stress. So that's whether people are experiencing difficulty or great difficulty making ends meet. Then we also include low household income. So that's in the bottom quintile of household income, and material deprivation. So this is how many items that that households are lacking. So it's items and activities, and we use that as a continuous variable in the analysis. And we look at the underlying risks of being in these experiencing these 3 measures. So we look at here, it shows the extent of poverty or economic vulnerability as we've just measured, how that is distributed across the different survey waves. So you can see it goes from about a low of about 9% in the first wave for the older cohort at 9 years of age. And then it goes up to a peak of about 28% in the 2011 wave for the 13-year-olds and the 2013 wave for the 5-year-olds. So this, and you can see we've mapped on here the unemployment rate, and you can see that it's tracking that the impact of the recession. So both cohorts are going through this very turbulent time in the labour market. So we then, to look at the longitudinal exposure of poverty, we group the families into different categories. So we first of all have this group, if we look first at this, at the 08 cohort, we have the group who are never poor, never economically vulnerable in any of the 4 waves. So that's about 60%, just under 60% of the group. We then have 22% who are poor at one of the surveys, or at least never in 2 consecutive surveys, and that's about 22%. Then we have this group who we call persistently vulnerable or poor, and they are poor in at least two consecutive waves, and then we have a small group who are 5% who are always poor, so in all 4 surveys. The categories are slightly different for the older cohort. This is because we've only 3 waves for that cohort rather than 4. So again, we have a similar proportion who are never poor, and similar proportions again who are once off in poverty, and then it's the same percentage who are always vulnerable. So I'm going to move straight to our analysis of transitions into and out of poverty. And I'm going to present the results for the 2008 cohort, so the younger cohort, but the results are very similar. The results are very similar for the older cohort as well. And we look at transitions between pairs of years. So we have 3 pairs of years that we can look at for the younger cohort. And we have 2 models. So one is exit from poverty. So this will only include those who are actually poor or vulnerable in one of the years. So in that analysis, we have about 4,400 pairs of years that we analyse. And then for the entry to poverty, this is obviously a much bigger group because it includes anyone who was not poor in the first of these pairs of waves. And then we have about 18,000 for that analysis. So what I'm going to do is just show you, rather than all the numbers, is show you, we've got sort of indicating the size of the effects for these different events or characteristics and how they influence. In the first column here is entry to poverty, and then the second column is exit from poverty. So basically, if we have a minus sign, this means that the odds ratios of this group exiting or entering poverty is lower than the reference group, and if it's a plus sign, it means that it increases the likelihood that they're entering or exiting poverty compared to the reference group. So we can see there's a period effect. Our reference period is 2008 to 11. So that is a period of a lot of poverty entrances. So compared to that group, to that period, there's no change really in entry in the second period, 11 to 13. But we do see that things are improving by the third period as Ireland exits recession. So we see less entries to poverty and more exits. We then look at a set of characteristics around the mother's characteristics really at age or at the first survey. And we can see that so low employment, low education for the mother is a strong predictor of entries to poverty, and they're less likely to exit poverty. Also, if the mother has a disability in wave 1, and then we see this effect for the family size. So as the family size increases, the risk of poverty entry goes up. We then move on to these dynamic or transition events. So we look first at life events, family events. We see there's no effect for having a new baby between the surveys, but we do see a strong effect for partnership change. So where a partner exits the household, the group are 3.5 times more likely to enter poverty compared to households where there's been no change in partnership status. And we find unexpectedly, I suppose, that having a repartnering also has increases the risk of moving into poverty. So then turning to the labour market events, the PCG here are again all the mothers labour market changes, and the bottom one is the father's labour market changes. So we see that moving into full-time work has a strong positive effect of leaving poverty, and that's true for both the mothers and the fathers. And we see that's a similar size of effect for mothers and fathers. going into part-time work doesn't have that effect. So they are no different from the cases where there's no change in employment. And this is, we also see this for the fathers. Exiting employment, so job loss, increases entries to poverty, and again for both mothers and fathers, and we see that they're similar size of effect there, which I think is interesting. And we find for both mothers and fathers that increasing hours from part-time to full-time increases the likelihood of exits. So then moving to the outcomes of poverty. So in the study itself, we look at a whole range of outcomes, and our aim here is really to look for depth, or for breadth rather than depth, I suppose. So we just look at the correlations between exposure to poverty and these outcomes. We don't do detailed causal analysis for each outcome. So just to give you an example of some of these, so looking first at one of the health indicators, which is illness and disability. So for both cohorts, we look at the most recent available information. So for the younger one, it's at 9 years, and for the older cohort, it's at 17 years. And we're saying, how does their duration of exposure to poverty, how is that associated with each of these outcomes? So we can see for the 9-year-olds, so for the group, the almost 60% who are never poor, about 10% of those have a chronic illness or disability at 9 years. This increases as we go up, 13% for the transient or one-off group, 18% for the persistent, and 21% for those who are always poor. Same pattern we can see for the 17-year-olds. So again, 10% for the never poor, up to 27% for always. So 3 times higher for this group who have the longest duration of exposure. And we see across a lot of the outcomes that we look at, we see the same gradient. The next one here is one of the items that we look at to look at more emotional and social well-being. So this is the SDQ, strengths and difficulties. So we're looking here at the percentage of people, young people who have a problematic score on this scale. And again, we see this gradient. So only 5% of those who were never poor, up to 15% of those who were always poor for the 9-year-olds, and again, an even stronger gradient here for the 17-year-olds, up to 17% for the small group, admittedly the 5% of the group who were always poor. Again, education. So we look at not only educational outcomes, we also in the report look at school engagement. But here we see for the younger group, we look at the Drum-Condra reading test scores. Again, so these are the mean here is 100. So you can see the scores falling downwards for as the duration of poverty increases. Similarly, for the 17-year-olds, we'll have tests of maths and vocabulary, and we see the same pattern. Though here the transient and the persistent group are similar here, but we still see the decline for the most exposed. So to summarize and draw out some of the implications. So first of all, I suppose one of the lessons is if we look over a longer time period, we see that exposure to poverty or economic vulnerability is much more common than we would see if we just looked at one snapshot picture in any of the 1 years. Now that's partly because we're covering this recession period, but even with that, we see a much higher proportion who have at least some experience of poverty. About half of the cases are it is transitory or once off. We also see that persistent poverty, so longer term exposure, is strongly socially structured. Now I didn't show these results here, but it's so the predictors of persistent poverty are low education, family status, ethnic minority membership, and parental disability. The analysis of the transitions shows us the really important role of maternal and paternal employment in persistent poverty and in exiting poverty or falling into poverty. And that full-time work has a much stronger effect there. It also highlights the very strong effect of relationship breakdown for these across childhood. So policies are needed to mitigate these risks. So I think that involves both income supports, including in-work supports, that are needed, especially if we're looking at low pay in part-time work. That in-work supports are particularly important. Childcare supports. So in order to enter employment, childcare is a particularly crucial service, especially for the parents of younger children. Active labour market policies are also important, and education and training in order to enable transitions into employment, and a whole range of other services, including, I suppose, family services to support families who are going through a family breakdown. One of the other lessons, I suppose, from the research is that that even transitory poverty is associated with a lot of negative outcomes, but the longer exposure is worse. So it seems to be this cumulative effect, and this is clear in both the older and the younger cohort. So I think it highlights that breaking this cycle of poverty is important throughout childhood, and that we can make interventions during older childhood as well as early childhood, and that can have important impacts for children's outcomes. So I'm going to stop there, and we will welcome any. First of all, we'll have Tanya responding, and then we'll have time for questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Helen. Huge amount of material, and I'm guessing lots of people are trying to work through some of the processes underlying some of the points that you've raised, but we'll come to that in a few minutes. But anyway, as Helen said, Tanya, we're delighted you're going to come along. Really interested to hear your perspectives, lots and lots of data and models and stuff, but interested to hear your sort of take from your perspective on the issues we're discussing. So I'll hand over to you.
Great. Well, look, thanks, Alan, for the invitation to speak at today's event and to the department as well. And I suppose the first thing I just wanted to say was really to commend the previous Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, Catherine Sapone, for commissioning this piece of work, and the current Minister for really spearheading this research basis. I'm chair of the National Advisory Council for Children and Young People, and one of the things the Council had been pushing for with the both ministers is having a very strong research evidence base to address what we already know is one of our big, massive problems in Irish society, are our high levels of child and youth poverty. I think this research gives us a very strong base to design a public policy that really gets under the hood and addresses some of the drivers for poverty, but also the impact of persistent poverty in itself. And I would urge people at the event to really look at the outcomes and the impact of poverty on children and young people's lives. I have to say, it's really distressing. For example, we're kind of used to, educational outcomes being poorer, but when you see self-concept and self-esteem, when you see those kind of outcomes being really poor for children at the age of 9, recording really negative views about themselves, you can really get a sense of this all-encompassing effect of poverty on children and young people. And I think we have a real problem in Ireland, and we know this in the Children's Rights Alliance because we commissioned public attitudes research around poverty, and we know that parents living through this experience, they are battered by it. They are making these really hard decisions on a daily basis. Do I pay the rent bill? Do I put food on the table? Or do I pay the electricity bill? And more often than not, it's the food on the table that suffers, or it's them, they're the ones that don't eat. But what the public believe is that the reason why children are having these very poor outcomes is because it's down to poor parenting. The public doesn't seem to understand in the data that actually they're living with major systematic issues that are causing poverty in children's lives. And you can see the threads of that in this research basis. And that's why I think we need to pay really critical attention to it. So in terms of my response, really what I wanted to highlight just some of the areas where I think we need to focus on in our public policy response, and also look at, let's say, where we need to go in the future. One of the things that jumps out of the data is not only the fact that, let's say, the more exposure to poverty, persistent poverty, the outcomes are poorer, but the other thing, and I would hear Dr. Alan Barrett saying this quite consistently, and this is a group of children that lived through the recession, is that this group of children and young people in all society, they are the ones that suffered the most during the last recession. And I say that in comparison to older people who were also economically vulnerable, them, yet decisions were made in that period to safeguard pension payments and in fact to increase them over the same period. And I think that's something we need to ask ourselves, why did that happen? Now, we all know why that happened, because older people have the right to vote and they're very good at exercising that. And that's something we have to ask our questions about for children and young people. They don't have the right to vote. And in fact, some of their parents, if they're very disadvantaged and if they're really struggling with daily life, they might be in a position to vote either themselves, just by trying to keep the head above water. And I think that's something we need to think about if we really want to address child and youth poverty in Ireland. Looking at the data, what I really liked about the way it was presented was focusing on these transitional events that can have a very negative effect on children and persistent poverty in itself. And what's really clear, if we're designing a public policy response, we need to think about those transitional events. And what shines through in the data, as been already mentioned by Helen, has been covered in the media, is relationship breakdown and change in employment. Now, I think we need to look at what kind of public policy response, what services do we have in place for people when those events happen in their lives, because we can see they have very negative consequences for children and young people. And what you find is actually there are responses in different parts of the country, but to be honest, they're a bit patchy. And in some parts of the country, there's some good services there, and in other parts of the country, there aren't. And it's really down to local innovation and local group solutions. And there's a real need to, at a national level, look at what the national response is to help families as they transition through these periods. The other thing that really struck me, and it really confirms what we know already from organisations working in the space, SVP, the disability organisations, Social Justice Ireland, the Vincentians, One Family, Spark, is that there are certain features, certain groups of families that are more likely to experience persistent poverty than others. So lone parents, parents with ethnic minority backgrounds, parents with low levels of maternal education, parents with a disability, and larger families. So I think we need to ask ourselves the question is, what are we doing to support those families and those parents? But the first off is, are we doing anything that's actually harmful to those parents, that plunges them further into poverty? We know during the last recession, there were some measures taken that impacted on lone parents, disproportionate in poverty. But I think we need to audit national policy in these areas to see what we can do. The department is very well placed, as the Minister has said. Not only does he have the brief for disability, equality, integration, but he has youth as well. So he's very well placed to look at these different parental groups to see what can be done to support them to exit the state of persistent poverty. The other thing that's really striking is the role of maternal and parental employment in education and training. And Helen has already talked about the importance of childcare. The Minister already mentioned that there's a vision for free childcare in the EU Child Guarantee. And I can't emphasise enough, this is probably one of the most serious issues that we need to address in Ireland. There's been lots of work done in this space to address poverty, including establishing a national childcare scheme. But I think one of the challenges is that scheme would work very well, but we have a market-based system of childcare. So childcare vary widely from Dún Laoghaire, which is really the most expensive childcare in the country, to Longford. And we need to have a system in place if we're really serious about addressing poverty, child poverty in Ireland, ensuring that childcare is practically free for parents on low income and parents on welfare payments. I think we expect them to be able to pay the shortfall in the market-based system. But the problem is, we know already that their welfare payments and what they're getting on low pay isn't sufficient even to eat a healthy diet. And yet we expect them to pay the shortfall in childcare. I think the other piece that's really important as well is the accessibility and availability of childcare as well. One of the things I know the Department of Education does is they analyse the child benefit data to make sure that there are enough school places for children around the country. Are we doing a similar exercise when it comes to childcare options for families? It's a bit more complex because some families will choose to look after their children at home. But we know from the organisations working with women on the ground that they're really struggling with access to childcare. And that's something I think that we need to address as well. The other thing coming through is that part-time work does not address child poverty. It's government policy, and that's driven by the European Commission to get people into work, to activate. And people may want to get into work for lots of reasons, for their own self-worth, to really get their career going. But it's not the solution, it would seem, to address child poverty. And I think we probably need a more sophisticated make sure that children aren't impacted by their parents taking up part-time work. That again, that goes into childcare costs, but it also goes into school-age childcare as well. We know that's one of the huge burdens that lone parents and other groups of low-income families say they're really struggling with as well. The other thing coming through is the value of welfare supports. And obviously there has been a considerable amount of work already done by the previous government and the current government in increasing welfare payments, particularly for, but if income is a critical issue still for families, and we know it is, then why aren't we raising welfare payments sufficient that people can have a healthy diet and we can address the child poverty rates? The other thing striking through is obviously the situation of families with multiple children. We reduced the child benefit welfare. The child benefit used to have extra payments for families with multiple children, and that was taken away during the recession. There's a strong case in this data to reintroduce that now. We know that these children are the ones that are carrying the brunt of poverty. Why aren't we increasing child benefit rates in relation to that? I suppose then, just concluding with some of my own perceptions on this as well, what's striking as well is that preventing poverty in middle to late childhood, what's coming through from the research, that it has very tangible benefits across a whole range of outcomes. And I'm not sure we do enough to think about poverty outside the bounds of the early years. We know that the impact of, if we get early years right, it does have a massive effect, but we could be missing opportunities along the life spectrum of children and young people to miss those kind of opportunities to address poverty. So what do we need in the short to medium term? Well, the Minister has already mentioned the EU Child Guarantee is a great opportunity for us to address poverty. It's coming from the European Commission. He's put together a unit in his department to act as an engine here. But I think we need to have a national act to be adopted urgently. The department is well placed here, obviously, to lead on that, but you can't underestimate the complexities here of cross-government working when you're trying to address child poverty. If you don't have a big enough engine within government, if you don't have enough commitment across government, particularly from other government departments, they're poverty proof, you're only going to be able to, let's say, address child poverty, not from the centre, but from the sides. So if I give you an example, medical care are a very strong measure to address child poverty, but those thresholds have not increased since before the recession. Now, if we as a government, the government is going to address child poverty, you can imagine each government department looking all of its measures to see what it can do to lift children and young people out of poverty. It's great to have a minister who's very committed to this space, but I do think we need the backing of the Taoiseach and the political party leaders in Fine Gael and in the Greens as well, because that will help the minister and all the committed champions across government and within our political circles who want to address child poverty. So we need to see the direction from the top on this. And I suppose the last thing I wanted to mention then is the involvement of children and young people. They're often silent in this debate, and actually many families experiencing poverty are silent because there is a shame, unfortunately, attached to living in poverty, and we have to remove that shame. But we actually have to have children and young people shaping the decisions that government are making in this space and helping to make the difficult political choices, because one of the challenges in this space is that there might be 20 different things that are needed. Government are only able to do a certain number on an annual basis. So, but what they need is help with the prioritisation, and children and young people should be there to help with those decisions. And I suppose I'll finish off with, I suppose, the last piece is around the right to vote. It's rare you hear people talking about voting rights when you talk about child poverty, but have to take the experience of older people in Ireland and the impact that they have had in really addressing social inequality and insecurity in Ireland. And I think something that we really need to think about is extending the right to vote to 16 and 17-year-olds. It could be done very easily just through an ordinary amendment of statute to allow them to vote in local and European elections. But I think if children and young people had the right to vote, I think you'd see a very different pace of change when it comes to addressing child and youth poverty in Ireland. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Tanya. Geez, lots to think about there. I expected sort of remarks directed at poverty, but we strayed into voting rights and public administration and everything like that. So that lots of interesting points, and thanks so much for that. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes for some Q&A. And again, Tanya, you should feel free to get involved in this if you want. The first thing I'm going to do, a number of questions have come in on some of the findings in regard to partnerships and relationship breakdown and reformation. And so actually, I'm going to put a question to you first, Helen, because I want to make sure I understand this. So it seems that the dissolution of a relationship led to a fall into poverty, but it also seemed like, am I getting this wrong, that relationship formation also seemed to be having that sort of trigger? So do you want to talk for a second, because there's a number of questions sort of trying to tease to what are the mechanisms that are producing those two results?
Yes, I mean, we don't have a definitive answer for that, I suppose, but it was interesting that it was there for both cohorts. So, because if you saw it for just one, you might think it might be something anomalous, but yeah, no, it's there and it's quite strong for both. I mean, we can speculate really that it might be to do with, there's additional needs if another person comes into the family, into the household, and the income they're bringing in is not sufficient to offset that additional need. It also could be that if there's an interaction with the benefit system, so that if there's a repartnering, that people are losing lone parent benefits. So it may be that interaction. Often when you see these things, you might look at think that it's something to do with how you measure income, and there's some equivalence scale, just to be quite technical. But actually, in this case, because we're not just using income, it's also deprivation and financial strain. So I don't think it's related to household equivalence and how we treat the number of people in the household. Bertrand, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just want to say as well, to add to what Helen was saying as well. There are many as well in the literature as well, what you can see as well, very often sometimes when you have a repartnering like that in the family, what happens as well, sometimes as well, you have an association as well, people moving house, changing job and so on. It's not really static where people are staying at the same place and you have a new partner coming in. very often as well, it's associated as well with a change in the family, so in the circumstance, in the living environment, for people moving house, changing job, and so on. So that could be as well one of the explanation as well to that.
I see what you mean, Bertrand. So essentially the relationship, what you're capturing in the data as a relationship change is sort of masking a range of other sort of changes that might be occurring as well. And can I ask you, Tanya, I mean, was it those twin results, okay, of both relationship dissolution and relationship formation having this sort of disruptive effect on families and triggering them into, was that a surprise to you, or does that sort of gel with your observations?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about it is if you look at the data for families who are experiencing homelessness, you'll see one of the areas that's often ticked is relationship breakdown is ticked, and I do think the housing market is part of the issue here. Your housing situation or option, and you're out into the rental market. I do think, and if you have a low income anyway to start with, I think you're already at a disadvantage. So I think that's probably part of the issue here. But I suppose what's mixed in with these stats as well are people experiencing domestic violence, right? So that must be underlying in these statistics, and the significant number of people experiencing domestic violence. And then I wonder with relationship changes is that there could be two families. So we know if you do break up, if you're going to sell your house, all these other things that happen when relationships break down, and trying to run two households where the children might be relocating from one household to the next, that's probably very expensive. But if actually then there's another partner and the other partner has children from another family who they're supporting, so you can see how it probably gets a little bit more complex as things move on. But I thought what was interesting was families who were, let's say, lone parents were better off than someone who became a lone parent down the road. So that was an interesting trajectory there. And I think we need to think about what kind of supports we have in place for families when they're going through this. We know there's some very good support organisations, and A1 Family is one of those organisations when they're going through relationship breakdown. TROR is another one. I think those kind of supports are really important for that one-to-one support. But also I think looking at the underlying issues, like what is it? Is it that you have to go out to the private rented market, and is that what the issue is, or do you have a problem getting access to HAP, or is it a split income? We probably need to know a little bit more to be able to design the public policy response.
Yeah, thanks for that. Actually, I think increasingly, whether or not in the Institute we're doing webinars on economic or social issues, the housing issue just seems to loom more and more in terms of its interaction with so many aspects of Irish economy and Irish society. I'm going to sort of wrap up a few questions here, Helen, and obviously Emer and Bertrand, if you want to join in. But questions around the measurement of poverty, and I think just this ongoing question: is it sufficient just to have a sort of an income type measure of poverty, or should we be looking at that sort of broader suite of I suppose you'd sort of say the social exclusion type issues, the extent to which people in poverty are sort of disconnected from so much of economic and social life. So do you want to just reflect briefly on how we're measuring poverty?
Yes, so I think income alone isn't enough to measure poverty, especially over time where there's a lot of change. So if you say it's the bottom 20% of the income distribution, obviously the proportions stay the same. And even with a poverty line, if everyone's losing income, then that's not a very good way of capturing the people's situation. So yeah, for this reason, we use this multiple dimension measure of poverty. So we're looking at a financial strain as well, and the access to goods and services. So I mean, I think that doesn't pick up everything, so there's obviously, I think the question was talking about other services as well that are really important to people that you don't capture even in those. But I think probably in those subjective evaluations, you know, of people's strain, that will come into it. You know, if you have to pay out of pocket for your medical expenses or whatever, that will manifest itself in your subjective answers to that, even if it won't come through just on the income. So yeah, I do think we need to take a broad approach to measuring poverty.
Okay, and is there an urban-rural divide? Was that looked at like in the paper?
We didn't include that, no. So, but I mean, it's something that it is possible to do with the GUI, because it's obviously a nationally representative sample. So you could look at that. Indeed.
Yeah, it has come up again in a number of the questions. As of things like the housing costs, somebody else has also mentioned here legal costs in the context of relationship breakdown. So again, it's just another important issue. We're going to end with only 3 minutes left, and I maybe ESRI colleagues and then Tanya can take a stab at this. A couple of people have asked this sort of question about, in the context of the debt levels, the national debt levels, this is coming out of COVID. And I clearly, I think what's implicit in the questions is that, are we going to see sort of cutbacks essentially as we move out of this. So I think some people are worried about the policy context now to sort of really tackle this problem. On the flip side, and I'll add this, it strikes me one of the sort of COVID lessons has been possibly a renewed sense of the role of government on occasions, and the sort of the importance of government as a solver of problems. So there's sort of two competing visions of the world that are coming through in the questions. One is a bit depressing, and the other, well, depending if you believe in big government or not, you know, different perspectives. So I don't know, Tanya, do you want to have 30 seconds on that particular issue? Are you optimistic or not, given the context of whether or not? And then I'll let Helen and Emer and Bertrand wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the tempo is a bit different this time around, because there isn't this push yet from Europe to impose austerity. And I think if we should go in. Now, what we all hear separately is that in government, people believe in the next 2 years there will be a level of austerity levelled at us in relation to key services. So what we need to do is make sure that those services that are critically important and those measures that are critically important are the ones that need to be safeguarded at a time when there is less money available to the government. I think that's the key. We need to make those decisions now, because I think what happened in austerity was, you know, decisions were made very quickly without the full implications of what impact they were going to have, and we need to be sure now what we need to keep in place for those children and young people and families.
Okay, and Helen, Emer, or Bertrand, a concluding comment?
Yes, no, I think we haven't seen the full effects, I suppose, of the COVID crisis yet, but I know that Bertrand and others did some analysis using the microsimulation, and did show that this was, we're expecting an increase in child poverty, but also it showed that the income supports, the PUP, they were really important in protecting families from poverty. So I think how those are unrolled or unraveled is going to be really, really important in the coming months. I do think the crisis has, as you say, I think it has underlined the importance of services, and particularly care services, in a way that maybe some weren't aware of before, the people that weren't using them directly. So that was something that came out of the Citizens' Assembly as well, that both myself and Emer were involved in, that people were in that very committed to not only to valuing those care services more, but we're willing to pay more taxes to do that. Now, whether that will happen in the ballot box is another thing, but that certainly was the message coming out of that we do realise now the importance of these services for the quality of people's lives.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, Bertrand, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just want to add to what Ellen was saying. In fact, it's true that what we found is that during the Great Recession, for example, I think the group of the population that has been the most affected, had the most dramatic changes in terms of exposure to poverty, but they were the children, not really elderly people. So there's no reason why, it's not going to happen again, that we know that's going to have an impact. And, quite likely, as Helen has mentioned, we've done some simulation, in the perspective that maybe there will be some recovery or not, but it shows already anyway that child poverty is going to increase.
Okay, thanks for that, Bertrand. So yeah, we're just after 11:30, so we should draw things to a close. So just once again, I want to thank and congratulate Helen, Bertrand, and Emer for a fantastic report and a fantastic presentation. Thank Tanya as well for coming along and providing her insights. Really enjoyed, found it very, very stimulating. I want to thank the Minister. Now, in his absence, of course, great always to have him coming along and talking about this work and engaging with it. And I think that there's comfort in that. Clearly, he's interested and committed. So long may that continue. And finally, obviously, want to thank our colleagues in the Department of Children for their ongoing engagement with this research program and the work that flows from it. Okay, so with that, I'm going to wish everybody a good day. Not sure if you'll have time to get out into the sun today or not, but maybe we'll be all nice to ourselves and at least have lunch out in the sun if we can. All right, so with that, I'll say goodbye. See ya.